I used to think the most dangerous words a man could say were, "I don't love you anymore." I was wrong. The most dangerous words were the ones I spoke without looking up from my phone. "She's just being dramatic again." At the time, they felt harmless, almost automatic, the kind of careless sentence that slips out when you've convinced yourself tomorrow will always come. I didn't know tomorrow had already chosen a different plan. Rain traced silver lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, blurring Manhattan into a sea of lights and shadows. 42 stories below, traffic crawled through the storm, while thunder rolled across the skyline like distant drums. Around the polished walnut conference table, 12 of my captains argued over shipping schedules, financial reports, and problems that demanded immediate decisions. Every pair of eyes eventually landed on me, because that was how my world worked. I was Adrian Romano. People waited for my answer before they breathed. My phone vibrated against the table. Emily. Her picture filled the screen. Blonde hair pulled behind one ear, blue eyes bright enough to soften even the longest day. I watched it ring until it stopped. One of my captains slid another folder toward me. "The contracts need your signature tonight." I nodded, picked up my pen, and signed without another thought. 30 seconds later, the phone buzzed again. Emily. Someone across the table glanced at the screen before looking back at me with an apologetic smile. "Everything okay, boss?" I exhaled through my nose. "Yeah." The call ended. A text appeared. "Can we please talk tonight? It's important." I stared at those words for exactly 3 seconds before locking the screen. Emily always wanted to talk after difficult weeks. She worked 12-hour shifts in the pediatric unit at St. Matthew's Children's Hospital, giving every ounce of herself to frightened kids and exhausted parents. By the time she came home, she carried everyone's pain except her own. I admired that about her. I just didn't always make room for it. The meeting continued. Numbers, deadlines, decisions, another vibration, another call. This time, I let it ring longer before silencing it. "She'll calm down," I muttered. One of the older men at the table chuckled knowingly. Women usually do. I almost smiled, but something about the joke landed wrong. Before I could think about it, the conference room doors opened quietly. My assistant stepped inside carrying fresh coffee. She hesitated when she noticed my expression. "Mr. Romano." Miss Carter called the office line too. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. "Tell her I'm busy." She sounded... My assistant searched for the right word. Upset. I leaned back in my chair. "She's just being dramatic again." The sentence hung in the room for only a heartbeat before business swallowed it whole. Papers shuffled, chairs moved, phones buzzed. Outside, rain beat harder against the glass. Miles away, Emily pulled into the parking lot outside our apartment building and sat behind the wheel without turning off the engine. Her windshield wipers pushed away sheets of rain that returned seconds later. She looked at the engagement magazine folded on the passenger seat, the corners worn from weeks of hopeful planning she had never shown me. Inside her purse rested a tiny velvet box holding a simple silver watch she had saved 3 months to buy for my birthday. She picked up her phone one more time. My voicemail answered almost immediately. "Hey." Her voice trembled before settling into something painfully calm. "I know you're busy. I always know you're busy. I needed you tonight. That's all." She stopped speaking for several seconds. The silence hurt more than tears ever could. "Drive home safely, Adrian." The call disconnected. She rested both hands on the steering wheel, closed her eyes, and whispered something no one else would ever hear before pulling back onto the rain-soaked street. Meanwhile, I signed the final page, stood from my chair, and thanked everyone for staying late. Thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the windows. My phone rested face down beside my notebook, silent now. I slipped it into my jacket pocket without checking the screen. If I had turned it over, I would have seen 4 missed calls, 1 voicemail, and a final message sent only 2 minutes earlier. I never read it that night. The meeting finally ended a little after 10:30, and the silence inside the conference room felt almost unfamiliar after 3 straight hours of negotiations. One by one, my captains gathered their folders, exchanged quiet goodnights, and disappeared into the hallway. The city outside remained wrapped in heavy rain, every streetlight glowing through the storm like blurred stars. I loosened my tie, rolled my shoulders, and reached for my phone with the confidence of a man convinced every problem could wait until morning. 4 missed calls from Emily. 1 voicemail. 1 unread message. I smiled to myself, already imagining the conversation. She would tell me I worked too much. I would apologize, promise to take a weekend off, and everything would be fine. That had become our routine. I tapped her number. It rang once, twice. Then her voicemail answered. "Hi, you have reached Emily Carter. I cannot answer right now. Please leave a message." I almost hung up without speaking, but something made me hesitate. "Hey," I said quietly. "The meeting just finished. I know you are probably asleep. I will be home in 20 minutes. I stopped there because I expected her to call me back before I even reached the elevator. She always did. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked through the private lobby where marble floors reflected the soft golden lights overhead. My driver hurried toward the entrance with an umbrella, but I waved him off. "I will drive myself." The cold rain hit my face the second I stepped outside, carrying the smell of wet pavement and distant traffic. For the first time all evening, I felt tired enough to notice how empty the city sounded after midnight. My black sedan started on the first push of the button. As I pulled into traffic, my thoughts drifted back to Emily. She had been quieter lately. Not angry, just distant. 3 nights earlier she had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me, still wearing her hospital scrubs, a medical journal resting on her lap. I had covered her with a blanket instead of waking her. At the time I thought it was kindness. Looking back, I wondered if it had simply been easier than having another conversation I was too exhausted to finish. A red light stopped me outside a 24-hour diner we used to visit when we first started dating. Emily loved their blueberry pancakes, even at 2 in the morning. She always laughed when the waitress recognized us, before we even sat down. One day, she had told me, we are going to be one of those old couples who still come here after 30 years. I remembered smiling without answering, because 30 years had always seemed guaranteed. The light turned green. I drove another 10 minutes before pulling into the underground garage beneath our apartment building. Her parking space was empty. That was unusual. Emily almost never stayed out this late before an early shift. Maybe she had gone back to the hospital. Maybe she was with her best friend, Sarah. Maybe she simply needed time to cool off. I repeated those possibilities so many times, they almost sounded believable. The apartment greeted me with complete darkness. No music playing softly from the kitchen. No cinnamon candle burning beside the window, no shoes kicked off near the front door, only silence. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the entrance. "Emily?" My voice echoed farther than it should have. Nothing answered. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the mug she had used that morning, still sitting beside the sink, with a lipstick mark fading along the rim. Her favorite light grey sweater hung neatly over the back of a chair. Everything looked normal except for the feeling settling into my chest. My phone buzzed. Relief washed over me so quickly I almost laughed. But the screen showed only a weather alert warning drivers about flooding on several highways north of the city. I called Emily again, straight to voicemail, then again, and again. By the 6th call, the confidence I had carried all evening had quietly begun to crack. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows with patient determination, and somewhere deep inside me, a thought I refused to acknowledge, whispered that this silence felt different from every silence that had come before. Sleep never came. I spent the rest of the night walking from one room to another, with my phone in my hand, convincing myself that every minute without an answer still belonged to the category of normal. Emily had every right to ignore me after the way I dismissed her. She had every reason to make me worry for a few hours. That was the story I kept telling myself because the truth waiting outside that story felt impossible to face. At 5:30 in the morning, I called St. Matthew's Children's Hospital. A cheerful receptionist answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Pediatric Unit. This is Adrian Romano. I am trying to reach Emily Carter." There was a brief pause while keys clicked on a keyboard. "Miss Carter has not checked in for her shift this morning." I frowned. Emily had never missed work without calling. Not once in the 4 years I had known her. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. Her supervisor has been trying to reach her as well." I thanked the receptionist and ended the call before she could ask another question. The apartment suddenly felt colder than it had an hour earlier. I called Sarah next. Emily's best friend answered with a sleepy voice. "Adrian, is everything okay? Is Emily with you?" Silence. Then, no. I thought she was with you. My stomach tightened. She never came home. Sarah was fully awake now. What do you mean she never came home? I mean I have been calling her all night. Another long silence. She left me a message yesterday afternoon, asking if we could have lunch this weekend, Sarah said quietly. She sounded tired, but nothing unusual. I thanked her, and hung up, already reaching for my jacket. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Manhattan wrapped in grey morning light. Water still dripped from rooftops while commuters hurried along sidewalks holding paper cups of coffee, living ordinary mornings that suddenly felt impossibly distant from mine. I drove the route Emily usually took between the hospital and our apartment, twice before sunrise fully disappeared behind low clouds. Every traffic light seemed to mock my growing impatience. Every familiar street reminded me of another memory. The bakery where she insisted on buying fresh cinnamon rolls every Sunday. The little bookstore where she once spent an hour choosing a novel for me because she claimed I needed stories that ended happily. I noticed all those places now because I had ignored them before. Around 8:15, one of my security coordinators called. "Boss, Highway Patrol reported an abandoned silver Honda matching Miss Carter's registration." My heart stopped. Where? Route 9, about 30 miles north of the city, near a wooded overlook. I reached the location in less than 40 minutes. Police vehicles were already parked along the shoulder, with hazard lights flashing quietly in the morning mist. Emily's car sat behind them, angled safely off the road. The driver's door was closed. The windows were intact. Rainwater still clung to the windshield in tiny silver beads. A state trooper approached me politely. "Sir, do you know the owner?" I nodded without taking my eyes off the car. "She is my girlfriend. We found the vehicle just after 6 this morning. There is no sign of her nearby." I walked closer. Her purse was gone. Her phone was nowhere inside the car. A half-empty bottle of water rested in the cup holder beside the folded engagement magazine I had never seen before. On the passenger seat lay the light blue cardigan she always carried, because hospital air conditioning made every floor feel too cold. I reached through the open window and touched the sleeve with trembling fingers. It was still faintly scented with the lavender detergent she always bought. That simple, familiar smell broke something inside me more completely than any terrible discovery could have. She had been here. She had been real. And now there was only silence. The trooper continued speaking, explaining procedures, search teams, and reports, but his words faded beneath the pounding of my own heartbeat. I looked down the empty highway stretching toward the horizon and realized I had crossed an invisible line sometime during the night. I was no longer waiting for Emily to call me back. I was praying someone, anyone, would tell me where she had gone. People like to believe that power can solve anything. Money finds answers, influence opens doors, fear makes obstacles disappear. I believed that for most of my adult life because I had watched it happen 1,000 times. Yet by the second afternoon, I had discovered the one thing my world could not command. Emily Carter was still missing. My office no longer looked like the place where billion-dollar decisions were made. Every screen displayed maps, traffic cameras, hospital admission records, hotel registrations, bus terminals, train stations, and airport manifests. Names and photographs covered the conference table where financial reports had sat only 24 hours earlier. My captains stood around the room waiting for instructions, but the usual confidence in their faces had been replaced by quiet concern. They had never seen me like this. "Start over," I said. "Every camera, every highway, every toll booth. I want every minute after she left our apartment." Nobody questioned the order. Phones immediately filled the room with low voices and hurried conversations. One team contacted private investigators. Another reached out to hospitals across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Others reviewed weather reports, roadside assistance calls, and emergency dispatch logs from the previous night. Every lead mattered, because every minute felt like another piece of Emily slipping farther away from me. By sunset, I had spoken with more strangers than I had during the previous 6 months. Nurses, receptionists, highway officers, hotel managers, convenience store clerks. I found myself asking the same question over and over. "Have you seen this woman?" Most answered with genuine sympathy before shaking their heads. A few promised to keep her photograph at the front desk. None of them knew that each polite apology felt heavier than the last. Late that evening, I drove to St. Matthew's Children's Hospital. The pediatric floor was quieter than I expected, filled with soft voices, colourful murals, and tiny wagons parked outside patient rooms. Emily had once told me she loved working nights, because children were often scared after dark, and sometimes all they needed was someone willing to sit beside them until they fell asleep. I never understood why she came home emotionally exhausted after every shift. Standing there now, watching nurses comfort anxious parents with gentle smiles despite their own fatigue, I finally began to understand. Her supervisor, Linda Dawson, met me near the nurses' station. She recognized me immediately, though we had met only once before at the hospital charity gala. "We have all been praying for her," she said softly. I thanked her, but my voice barely sounded like my own. "Did she ever mention going anywhere?" Linda thought for a long moment before answering. "Emily always talked about other people, never herself, but," she hesitated. "The last few weeks she seemed disappointed. Not with work, with something she could never quite explain." I lowered my eyes. She did not have to explain it anymore. I already knew. On my way out, I passed the small pediatric playroom Emily had shown me months earlier. Crayon drawings covered one wall beside handwritten thank you cards from children she had helped through difficult recoveries. One picture caught my attention. It showed a smiling nurse holding hands with a little boy beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, uneven letters read, "Thank you, Miss Emily, for staying when everyone else went home." I stood there much longer than I should have, staring at words written by a child who understood something I had failed to see. Emily had always stayed, for frightened children, for grieving parents, for complete strangers, and for me. Even after every cancelled dinner, every interrupted vacation, every promise I postponed until next month, she stayed. When I returned to headquarters close to midnight, one of my investigators hurried toward me carrying a tablet. "Boss, we recovered additional highway footage from a service station about 8 miles south of where her car was found." My pulse quickened. The video showed Emily's silver Honda pulling into the brightly lit parking area shortly before 11 that night. She stepped out carrying her phone, walked beneath the awning to escape the rain, and tried calling someone again. Even without sound, I recognized the slight slump of her shoulders when nobody answered. She stood there for almost 2 minutes before quietly returning to her car and driving back into the storm. I did not need to guess who she had been calling. She had been reaching for me until the very end, and I had mistaken her hope for inconvenience. On the third day, the search outside slowed down, so I finally walked into the one place I had avoided from the beginning. Emily's apartment. She had kept it even after we started spending most nights together, because she always said everyone deserved one place in the world that belonged completely to them. I used to tease her about paying rent for an apartment she barely used. Now I stood outside the familiar blue door with a key she had insisted I keep, realizing I had never once unlocked it when she was not beside me. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and fresh linen, exactly the way it always had. Nothing looked abandoned. Her favorite cream-colored throw blanket was folded neatly across the couch. A pair of running shoes waited beside the front door. A tiny succulent sat on the kitchen windowsill, still reaching toward the morning light. Everything felt alive, as though Emily might walk out of the bedroom at any second, smile at me, and ask why I looked so worried. I slowly walked through each room, touching nothing at first. Family photographs lined a bookshelf beside medical textbooks and children's storybooks she sometimes borrowed from the hospital library to read to young patients. There were framed pictures from our vacations, birthday dinners, and quiet Sunday mornings. In every photograph, Emily smiled with her whole heart. Looking at them, I realized something painful. I could remember where every picture had been taken, but I could not remember the last time I had truly looked at her, instead of the next meeting waiting on my calendar. My eyes settled on a small wooden desk beneath the bedroom window. A leather journal rested there beside a ceramic mug filled with colorful pens. I hesitated before opening it. It felt like crossing into a place I had never been invited, but I also knew Emily would never hide the truth from me anymore. The first pages were ordinary, notes about work. Funny things children had said during therapy sessions, grocery lists, book recommendations. Then the handwriting became quieter somehow, each sentence carrying more weight than the one before it. Today, Adrian promised we would have dinner together. He cancelled again. I know he did not mean to hurt me. I just wish he knew disappointment can become lonely when it happens often enough. I turned another page. A little girl asked me today if heroes ever get tired. I told her everyone does. Even the strongest people need someone to sit beside them sometimes. I smiled while saying it, but I realized I was answering my own question too. My throat tightened. Another page. Adrian bought me the most beautiful necklace for my birthday. Everyone thinks I am lucky because he gives me wonderful things. The truth is, I would trade every gift for one uninterrupted evening where he leaves his phone in his pocket and laughs the way he used to. I had spent thousands of dollars trying to show Emily I loved her, never understanding she had been asking for something money could never buy. Inside the journal rested a folded receipt from a small jewelry store in Brooklyn. Attached to it was a handwritten note that simply read, "Pick up after resizing." Curious, I searched the bedroom until I found a tiny velvet box tucked inside the top dresser drawer. My hands trembled as I opened it. A simple platinum wedding band rested on white satin. Inside the lid, a small card in Emily's handwriting read, "Maybe I will give this to him, if he ever has one evening free." I sat on the edge of her bed, unable to breathe. She had planned to ask me. All those months I believed I was waiting for the perfect time to propose. She had been quietly hoping to build the same future. Beneath the ring box lay a folded calendar page covered with small blue hearts. Every heart marked a day we were supposed to have dinner, watch a movie, visit her parents' favorite lighthouse, or simply stay home together. Almost every date had a tiny pencil note beside it. Rescheduled. Emergency meeting. Maybe next week. It struck me then that Emily had never been keeping track of my failures. She had been protecting her hope. She believed each cancelled plan would eventually become the one that finally happened. I closed the journal and held it against my chest, surrounded by a life filled with patience, kindness, and quiet love that I had mistaken for certainty. Emily had never wanted my fortune, my influence, or my last name. She had only wanted the one thing I kept promising after one more meeting, one more deal, one more tomorrow. She had wanted me. The fourth morning arrived with no miracle waiting outside my door. The rain had finally disappeared, replaced by a pale blue sky that felt almost insulting. The world had already started moving forward, while mine remained trapped somewhere on a lonely stretch of highway where Emily's trail had simply ended. I had not slept for more than an hour since she vanished. Coffee had replaced meals. Hope had become routine instead of emotion. Then, just after 9 o'clock, one of my investigators rushed into the office, carrying a laptop with an expression I had learned to recognize. It was the face people wore when they were afraid to deliver news that could change everything. "Boss," he said quietly, "we recovered additional surveillance footage from 3 locations that were not included in the original traffic report." My heartbeat became painfully loud. He connected the laptop to the conference room screen, and grainy security footage filled the wall. The first camera showed Emily leaving the service station I had already seen. She drove carefully despite the rain, both hands on the steering wheel, never speeding, never acting recklessly. The second camera, nearly 20 minutes later, captured her pulling onto the shoulder beneath an overpass. She stepped out, holding her phone against her ear, while pacing beneath the concrete shelter. Even without audio, I knew exactly what she was doing, calling me again. The timestamp burned into my memory. 11:23 at night. I reached for my own phone and opened my call history. At exactly 11:23, my screen showed one incoming call from Emily. Duration, missed. At that exact moment, I had been sitting at the head of the conference table, discussing expansion plans, with men who had probably forgotten every word of that meeting by sunrise. I had looked at her name. I had chosen not to answer. Nobody in the room spoke. The silence grew heavier as the next video began. This camera belonged to a small grocery store, a few miles farther north. Emily walked inside, purchased bottled water and a small first aid kit, then smiled politely at the cashier before leaving. She looked tired, but she was safe. She was alive. My investigator paused the frame. There is more. The final recording came from a hospital emergency entrance nearly 40 miles beyond where her car had later been discovered. A silver pickup truck stopped beneath the canopy just after midnight. Two paramedics stepped out, opened the passenger door, and carefully helped a young woman toward a wheelchair. Her clothes matched the outfit Emily had been wearing the night she disappeared. Her hair was soaked from the rain. One of the paramedics wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before pushing her through the automatic doors. I stepped closer to the screen until the pixels blurred together. Zoom in. The image sharpened just enough for me to see her face. Emily, pale, exhausted, awake, but visibly disoriented. Why was this never reported? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. Another investigator answered. She was admitted without identification. Her purse and phone were never recovered. The hospital listed her as Jane Doe because she could not remember her full name after the accident. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. What accident? According to preliminary medical notes, another driver found her walking near the roadway after her vehicle experienced mechanical trouble during the storm. She appeared confused and suffered a concussion. There was no indication of criminal activity. Doctors believed the temporary memory loss was caused by the head injury. I closed my eyes, but that only made everything worse. Emily had not disappeared into darkness. She had reached a hospital. She had survived. She had been alive while I searched in the wrong places. Where is she now? Another painful silence followed. She was transferred 3 days later to a neurological rehabilitation center in Vermont that specializes in temporary memory recovery. Because she remained unidentified, nobody connected her to the missing person report until we matched the hospital footage this morning. I lowered myself into the nearest chair because my legs no longer trusted the floor beneath them. Every terrible possibility I had imagined suddenly became one unbearable truth. Emily had spent those first hours alone, frightened, unable to remember who she was. She had called me until she no longer could. If I had answered just one of those calls, I would have known where she was before midnight. I would have been beside her hospital bed before sunrise. Instead, the woman who had never stopped choosing me had awakened in a strange place without a name, while I sat inside a room full of power, believing there would always be another chance to answer tomorrow. The drive to Vermont took a little over 5 hours, but time had stopped meaning anything long before I crossed the state line. Every mile carried a different memory of Emily. I remembered the first road trip we had ever taken together, when she insisted on stopping at every small-town diner because she believed the best pie was never served in big cities. I remembered her singing off-key with the windows down because she said life was too short to care who was listening. Somewhere between New York and the Green Mountains, I realized I had spent years hearing her voice without truly listening to what she was trying to tell me. The rehabilitation center stood on a quiet hillside, surrounded by towering maple trees and wide fields that glowed beneath the afternoon sun. It looked more like a college campus than a medical facility. Wind stirred the leaves with a soft whisper that somehow made the place feel peaceful instead of lonely. I parked my car, but remained behind the steering wheel for nearly a full minute, gripping it tightly while my heartbeat echoed inside my ears. I had faced boardrooms, federal investigators, and men who built their reputations on intimidation without ever feeling fear like this. A nurse greeted me inside the reception area with a warm but cautious smile. "Can I help you?" I handed her a photograph of Emily. "My name is Adrian Romano. I believe she is here." The nurse looked down at the picture before slowly nodding. She arrived several days ago under temporary identification. Her memory has improved significantly over the last 48 hours. My chest tightened with relief, so intense it almost hurt. "Can I see her?" She hesitated just long enough to make me understand the answer would not be simple. "I will ask her." Those 4 words landed harder than I expected. I had spent years living in a world where doors opened because I asked them to. This one would open only if Emily wanted it to. I sat alone in the waiting room watching sunlight drift across the wooden floor, while an old grandfather clock counted every passing second with quiet determination. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 20. Finally, the nurse returned. "She agreed to see you." I stood so quickly the chair slid backward across the floor. She led me through bright hallways decorated with watercolor paintings created by former patients. Everything about the building encouraged healing. Soft colors, large windows, fresh flowers on every table. It was the kind of place Emily would have loved. We stopped outside a small garden, where patients could sit beneath flowering trees. "She is there," the nurse whispered, before quietly walking away. Emily sat alone, on a white wooden bench, reading a paperback novel. The breeze lifted strands of her blonde hair across her face. She looked thinner than I remembered, but healthy, alive. Beautiful in the ordinary way that had always stolen my breath far more than perfection ever could. For several seconds I simply watched her breathe, because I had imagined this moment so many times that reality almost felt unreal. She slowly looked up from the book. Our eyes met. Every emotion I had carried for days rushed forward at once. Relief, gratitude, regret, hope. Emily. Her name barely escaped my lips. She closed the book carefully before standing. There was no anger in her expression, no tears, only a quiet sadness that seemed older than either of us. I stepped forward instinctively, but stopped myself after one pace. "I am so sorry," I whispered. "I should have answered. I should have been there." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands together and looked at me with gentle eyes that somehow hurt more than if she had shouted. "I remember everything now," she said softly, "not all at once." It came back little by little. I nodded, unable to speak. "The accident took my memory for a while," she continued. "But losing my memory was not the hardest part." She looked toward the mountains stretching beyond the garden. "Remembering was." My heart sank. "Emily, please." She slowly turned back toward me. "When I remembered calling you over and over, I also remembered how alone I felt long before that night." Tears blurred my vision, but I did not look away. She took one slow breath before speaking the words that finally shattered the last illusion I still carried. "Please leave, Adrian." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse me. She simply spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had exhausted every chance she knew how to give. "I cannot trust my heart with you again." In that moment I understood. There are wounds that no amount of power can erase, apologies that cannot immediately heal what years of neglect have broken, and punishments far heavier than losing an empire. I had found the woman I loved, but for the first time since I met Emily Carter, I realized that finding her did not mean I still deserved to keep her. I walked away from the rehabilitation center without asking anyone to stop her or convince her to change her mind. For years I had believed that persistence meant refusing to accept no as an answer. Emily taught me that real love sometimes begins by respecting the answer you do not want to hear. The drive back to New York felt different from the one that had brought me there. Hope had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. I was no longer chasing a way to bring Emily home. I was trying to become someone worthy of standing beside her again, even if that day never came. The first decision I made surprised everyone around me. I cancelled 3 expansion projects that had dominated my calendar for months. My captains stared across the conference table as though they had misunderstood. One finally cleared his throat. "Boss, those deals represent millions of dollars." I looked at the skyline outside my office window before answering. "Then let them go." Nobody argued. They had spent years watching me choose business over everything else. Now they watched me choose something they could not measure on a balance sheet. A week later, I visited St. Matthew's Children's Hospital, without security, without cameras, and without announcing my arrival. Linda Dawson recognized me immediately. "Emily is still recovering," she said gently, before I could speak. I nodded. "I know. I am not here to ask about her." Instead, I asked how I could help the pediatric unit. The hospital had been trying to renovate an aging therapy wing for almost 2 years, but funding always fell short. I quietly paid for the entire renovation on one condition: no room would carry my name. Every child who walked through those halls deserved to believe kindness could exist without expecting applause. I also established a scholarship for nursing students who wanted to work in pediatric care after graduation. When the hospital board offered to hold a press conference, I politely declined. Emily had never helped children because someone was watching. If I wanted to honor what she believed, I had to learn the same lesson. Months passed. My routines changed in ways that once seemed impossible. I left the office before sunset whenever I could. I answered every phone call, even during meetings. I started visiting my mother every Sunday afternoon because I realized I had been postponing those visits with the same careless confidence that had almost cost me the woman I loved. One evening, she looked at me across the dinner table and smiled sadly. "You finally learned that success is not measured by how many people wait for you." I lowered my eyes. It took me too long. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Sometimes, the longest lessons become the ones we never forget. Every few weeks I drove to Vermont, but I never asked to see Emily. I left a handwritten letter at the front desk instead. Not flowers, not jewelry, not expensive gifts, just simple letters telling her about ordinary moments. A little boy laughing after finishing physical therapy, the new children's reading room opening at the hospital. My first weekend without checking business emails. I never asked for forgiveness. I never asked her to come back. I only wanted her to know that the promises I had spoken for years were finally becoming actions. Some letters were never answered. Others disappeared inside the quiet rhythm of passing seasons. Still, I kept writing because for the first time in my life, I understood that love was not proven by grand speeches. It was proven by consistency. One snowy afternoon, nearly 6 months after Emily left New York, I stopped outside the hospital and watched parents carry sleeping children through the front entrance beneath colorful umbrellas. Nurses hurried toward the automatic doors with coffee cups warming their hands. Life continued in thousands of ordinary moments that once seemed too small for my attention. They no longer felt small. They felt precious. I remembered something Emily had written in her journal about heroes getting tired. Back then I believed strength meant carrying every burden alone. Now I understood that true strength was making time for the people who quietly carried pieces of your heart every single day. I could not erase the night I ignored her calls. I could not rewrite the pain my choices had caused. But every sunrise after that night offered me another chance to become a better man than the one who had looked at her name on a glowing screen and believed tomorrow was guaranteed. Whether Emily ever chose to walk beside me again was no longer something I could control. The only thing I could control was becoming the man she had deserved all along. The first warm day of spring arrived almost 7 months after I walked out of the rehabilitation center, carrying nothing except regret. The maple trees outside St. Matthew's Children's Hospital had begun to bloom again, their pale green leaves catching the afternoon sunlight, in quiet celebration of another season beginning. Every Thursday, after finishing my meetings, I drove to the same bench across the street, with a plain paper cup of black coffee that always grew cold before I remembered to drink it. There were no bodyguards waiting nearby, no luxury cars lined along the curb, no expensive flowers resting beside me. Just an ordinary man sitting beneath an old oak tree, watching nurses hurry through the hospital doors and parents hold the hands of children who smiled despite difficult days. Somewhere along the way, those quiet hours had become the most important part of every week. They reminded me of the life Emily had always tried to show me, a life built one small act of kindness at a time, instead of one grand victory after another. That afternoon I was reading through renovation updates for the new pediatric therapy wing when I heard familiar footsteps crossing the sidewalk. I looked up instinctively, and for a brief moment my heart forgot how to beat. Emily stood only a few feet away, wearing light blue scrubs beneath a cream-colored cardigan. The spring breeze lifted strands of her blonde hair, exactly the way it had the first day we met outside the hospital years ago. She looked healthy, strong, peaceful. She had returned to New York 2 weeks earlier after completing her rehabilitation, but I had honored my promise to give her space. I had not called. I had not appeared outside her apartment. I had simply trusted that if our paths were ever meant to cross again, they would. She smiled politely before glancing at the untouched coffee in my hands. "You still let it get cold." I laughed softly, surprised that I still remembered how to laugh. Some habits take longer to fix than others. She nodded, then looked toward the hospital entrance, where children chased each other across the courtyard, while parents tried unsuccessfully to slow them down. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence no longer felt painful. It felt honest. I slowly stood from the bench, but stayed exactly where I was. "If you walk away today," I said quietly, "I will understand." The words carried no desperation, no hidden expectation, only acceptance. Emily studied my face for a long time, as though searching for traces of the man who had once believed every promise could wait until tomorrow. Finally, she took one careful step toward me, then another. When she stopped in front of me, her eyes filled with gentle tears that never quite fell. She reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and I realized I had dreamed about that simple feeling more than any dramatic reunion I could have imagined. "I am not coming back because you begged," she whispered. I swallowed hard, unable to answer. She squeezed my hand just a little tighter. "I am coming back because you finally became the man I was waiting for." Every wall I had spent years building around my heart quietly disappeared. I felt tears blur my vision before I could stop them, and for the first time in my adult life I did not try to hide them. Emily smiled through her own tears and gently brushed one away from my cheek with the kindness that had always defined her. "You answered every letter," she said softly. "Even the ones I never replied to." I nodded. "Because you deserved every word." She looked toward the children's wing, where bright murals now covered walls that had once been faded and worn. "Linda told me you never put your name anywhere." I smiled. "It was never supposed to be about me." She laughed quietly, the same laugh that had once filled tiny diners during late-night road trips. "I know." We stood together watching the afternoon sun stretch long shadows across the courtyard, while children filled the air with fearless laughter. Nothing about the moment felt extraordinary, yet somehow it was the most extraordinary moment of my life. Months earlier, I would have believed love was proven by protecting someone from the world. Emily taught me that love is proven by being fully present inside the ordinary moments the world quietly gives us every day. As we walked away from the hospital side by side, I realized I was no longer leaving with the woman I had almost lost. I was walking beside the woman who had patiently taught me that the strongest man in any city is never the one everyone fears. He is the one who learns, before it is too late, that the people who love you should never have to compete with tomorrow.